Hey guys, welcome back to another absolutely wild historical adventure that'll completely destroy every stereotype you've ever had about Native Americans from Hollywood movies, Thanksgiving mythology, and whatever whitewashed version of history they taught you in elementary school. Tonight we're traveling back to 1491, the last year before Columbus arrives and ruins literally everything, to experience what life was actually like for indigenous peoples in the Americas before European contact transformed their world into a catastrophic nightmare. Before we embark on this journey through pre-colonial America where your survival depends on skills you absolutely don't possess, smash that like button if you've ever realized that everything you learned about Native Americans in school was probably wrong or incomplete. Subscribe for more time-traveling chaos that explores actual history instead of sanitized mythology, and drop a comment letting me know which Native American tribe would you want to be part of and why. Because after tonight's story you'll understand that Native American isn't one culture, but hundreds of distinct societies with completely different ways of life. Now get comfortable, maybe put away any John Wayne movies or Pocahontas cartoons, and let's discover what pre-colonial life was really like for indigenous peoples who had been thriving in the Americas for thousands of years before Europeans showed up claiming to have discovered continents that were already heavily populated. Trust me, by the end of this tale you'll never look at Thanksgiving the same way again. Waking up in a tipi, your eyes flutter open to a world that is immediately, completely, terrifyingly different from anything you've ever experienced. You're not in your bed, you're lying on animal furs and woven mats that smell like smoke, leather and earth. Above you is not a ceiling but a curved structure made from what appears to be animal hides stretched over wooden poles, with smoke rising from a central fire toward an opening at the top. The air is thick with smells you can't immediately identify: burning wood, dried meat, tanned leather, herbs, and the general organic aroma of a dwelling that's never been cleaned with modern disinfectants, because those won't be invented for another. Your modern nose finds the olfactory assault overwhelming, but you're too confused and disoriented to fully process the sensory information bombarding your unprepared senses. Sitting up slowly, your body feels different, stronger in some ways, adapted to physical labor in ways your modern sedentary form never was, yet also strange and unfamiliar. You're wearing clothing made entirely from animal skins and plant fibers, no synthetic fabrics, no modern textiles, nothing that came from a factory, because factories don't exist yet. The leather is soft but also stiff in place, decorated with intricate beadwork or quillwork that represents hours of skilled labor, and fits your body in ways that suggest it was made specifically for you by someone who knows traditional clothing construction techniques passed down through generations. But the clothing is the least shocking aspect of your new reality. Looking around the interior of your dwelling, you see other people still sleeping on their own fur beds, men, women and children sharing this communal space in a way that would violate every modern privacy norm you're accustomed to. The family structure is immediately obvious but also confusing, because there seem to be more adults than a typical nuclear family would include. Extended family members, possibly multiple wives or husbands depending on this tribe's marriage customs, all living together in intimate proximity that modern people would find suffocating. Your phone is gone, your watch is gone. Every piece of modern technology that you depend on has vanished, replaced by tools and objects made from stone, bone, wood and other natural materials that represent thousands of years of accumulated indigenous technology and craftsmanship. You're not just in a different place, you're in a completely different technological era where everything you know about how the world works is suddenly irrelevant and potentially dangerous if you try to apply modern logic to pre-modern situations. The fire in the center of the dwelling provides the only light besides what's filtering through the smoke hole above. There's no electricity, no light switches, no way to illuminate this space except through controlled burning of wood and the natural daylight that enters through the door flap and smoke opening. Darkness will be absolute and terrifying in ways that modern people who've never experienced true darkness, the kind that exists before artificial lighting, can't fully imagine or prepare for. Psychological. And then someone stirs and sees you sitting up, which is when things get really complicated. First realization: you're not in Kansas anymore. An older woman, possibly your mother or aunt in this reality, sits up and speaks to you in a language that sounds absolutely nothing like English or any language you've ever heard. The phonetic patterns are completely foreign, utilizing sounds that don't exist in European languages. The grammatical structure is unlike anything in your linguistic experience, and you have zero ability to understand or respond appropriately to what she's saying to you. Your blank stare and obvious confusion cause her expression to shift from casual morning greeting to concerned assessment. She speaks again, more slowly this time, enunciating carefully as if speaking to someone who's hard of hearing. And when you still don't respond appropriately, she reaches over and touches your forehead as if checking for fever. In her worldview, sudden inability to speak properly probably indicates illness, spirit possession, head injury, or some other medical or spiritual emergency requiring immediate attention from healers or shaman. Other family members are waking now, disturbed by the unusual conversation, and they're all staring at you with expressions ranging from concern to confusion to suspicion. You try to speak, but what comes out is English, a language that won't exist in the Americas for another year, when Spanish conquistadors and then English colonizers bring European languages to these continents. Your English words sound as foreign and nonsensical to them as their language sounds to you, creating a communication barrier that's absolute and terrifying for everyone involved. But the language barrier is just the beginning of problems you're about to discover. You try to stand up and immediately realize that your modern, sedentary body, even if somehow transformed to match indigenous physique, is operating with a modern brain that's completely unprepared for the physical realities of indigenous life. Your muscles might be adapted, but your motor skills are not. Your hands might be coalesced, but your mind doesn't know how to use traditional tools. Your feet might be tough, but you don't know how to read trails or navigate without GPS. The older woman gestures for you to stay seated while she goes to the fire and begins doing something with a clay pot and what appears to be cornmeal mixed with water. You watch, fascinated and confused, as she prepares what must be breakfast using techniques and tools that are completely foreign to you despite their elegant simplicity. There are no stoves, no microwaves, no refrigerators, just fire, clay pots, wooden implements, and hands that know through decades of daily practice how to create food from raw materials without modern conveniences. Other family members are moving about now, performing morning routines that look choreographed through long familiarity. Everyone seems to know exactly what they're supposed to do, what their roles are, how to navigate this space and these activities efficiently without verbal coordination. Everyone except you, sitting there like a confused child who doesn't understand the most basic aspects of daily life that even toddlers in this community grasp intuitively. And then someone hands you what is clearly a work tool, expecting you to know exactly what to do with it. Meeting your new family who speaks no English. A young man, possibly your brother or cousin based on age and how he addresses you, hands you what appears to be a stone knife or scraping tool with a wooden handle and gestures toward a pile of animal hides that clearly need processing. He demonstrates briefly, showing you scraping motions that remove fat and tissue from the inside of the hide, creating smooth leather suitable for clothing or shelter construction, then hands the tool back to you and waits expectantly for you to begin working on the task that needs completion today. You stare at the tool and the hide with absolutely no idea how to proceed properly. You've never processed animal skins, never worked with stone tools that require completely different handling than metal implements, and have no concept of how to do this task that is apparently so routine and basic that even children in this community can do it competently by age 7 or 8. Your ignorance is immediately obvious to everyone watching, and their expressions shift from expectation to confusion to something approaching concern or suspicion about what's wrong with you. The older woman intervenes, taking the tool from your hands and demonstrating more slowly and carefully, as if teaching a small child or someone who suffered a head injury. She's patient but clearly puzzled by your complete lack of basic skills that every person in this community learns in early childhood through observation and practice. Your incompetence at basic daily tasks is marking you as either injured, ill, or somehow fundamentally wrong in ways that are making everyone increasingly nervous about your condition and what it might mean. But your inability to perform simple tasks is creating a crisis of identity that's about to get much worse. As morning progresses and more family members interact with you, it becomes increasingly clear that you're supposed to be someone specific in this community, someone with established relationships, roles and responsibilities that you know nothing about because you weren't actually here until this morning. People address you with what must be your name, though you don't recognize it, expect you to know theirs, and reference shared experiences and relationships that you have no memory of because you weren't actually present for any of the life events they're referencing. You try gesturing to indicate that you don't understand, that something is wrong, that you need help, but your gestures are modern and Western, carrying meanings that might be completely different or nonsensical in this cultural context. The OK sign, thumbs up, pointing, all these gestures you think are universal might actually be communicating insults, threats, or bizarre statements that make your already confusing behavior even more alarming to people who are trying to understand what's happened to you. An elderly man, possibly a grandfather or respected elder based on how others defer to him, is called over to assess your condition. He looks at you with eyes that have seen much and understood more, studying your face and behavior with an intensity that makes you deeply uncomfortable. He speaks quietly to the older woman, and while you can't understand words, their tones and gestures suggest they're debating whether you're sick, possessed by malevolent spirits, or somehow fundamentally changed from whoever you were supposed to be before this morning. And that's when you realize that your survival in this community depends on somehow learning their language, customs and skills before they decide you're too damaged or dangerous to keep around. The community's response to your strange behavior will determine whether you're cared for as a sick family member who needs healing, treated as a spiritual crisis requiring shamanic intervention and possibly dangerous rituals, or viewed as a threat to be dealt with through exile or work. Indigenous communities in 1491 have sophisticated understanding of mental states, spiritual crises and unusual behaviors, but they interpret these conditions through frameworks that are completely different from modern psychology or medicine, and which might lead to treatments that would terrify you. You need to communicate somehow that you're not dangerous, that you want to learn and integrate, that you're worth keeping alive despite your obvious uselessness at everything they consider basic life skills necessary for community membership. But without language, without cultural knowledge, without any of the skills that make you valuable or even tolerable in this society, you're essentially a burden that the community has no obligation to support and every practical reason to abandon. The morning meal is eventually distributed, some kind of corn-based porridge that's unlike anything you've eaten before, but which fills your stomach with warmth and calories that you're going to desperately need for the physical labor that's expected of you regardless of your incompetence. You eat carefully, watching how others handle the food, trying to learn through observation what utensils, if any, are appropriate and what eating customs you need to follow to avoid giving offense. But food is just one of countless daily activities that you know nothing about and must somehow learn to perform if you want to survive more than a few days in four. The family members exchange worried glances as they watch you struggle with basic tasks. A young girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, giggles at your clumsy attempts to eat properly, but she's quickly shushed by adults who clearly don't find the situation amusing. Whatever has happened to you is serious, and the community will need to decide soon how to respond to your condition and whether you represent a problem that needs solving through spiritual healing, physical isolation, or Plains Indians versus woodland tribes versus Southwest Pueblos. Over the next few confusing hours, as you're essentially supervised like a child who can't be trusted alone, you begin piecing together clues about which tribal group you've landed in, based on environmental observation, architectural styles, clothing patterns, and the types of activities people are engaged in around you. The differences between indigenous nations are enormous, comparable to differences between medieval Europe and medieval China, and your survival strategies will depend heavily on which specific culture you're now part of, whether you like it or not. The tipi structure suggests you might be with plains tribes who follow buffalo herds across vast grasslands, living in portable dwellings that can be dismantled and moved quickly when the herd migrates or when resources in one area become depleted. But you also notice more permanent structures nearby, possibly earth lodges or semi-permanent dwellings, that suggest a semi-sedentary lifestyle with seasonal mobility rather than constant migration. The combination of portable and permanent architecture indicates a mixed subsistence strategy that's common in transitional zones between different ecological regions where tribes adapt to multiple environments. The clothing styles provide additional clues about your location and cultural identity. The specific cut of garments, the types of decorative elements, the materials used for construction, the colors and patterns, all reflect regional traditions and available resources that vary dramatically across different tribal territories spanning thousands of miles. The beadwork patterns or quillwork designs follow aesthetic traditions that are specific to particular regions and cultural groups, though without cultural knowledge you can't read these visual languages that communicate identity, status, clan affiliation, and personal achievements to anyone who knows how to interpret them. But even identifying your general region doesn't tell you which specific nation or band you're with. Indigenous peoples in 1491 are not a monolithic Native American culture, but rather hundreds of distinct nations with unique languages that aren't mutually intelligible, customs that vary dramatically, political systems ranging from democratic councils to hereditary leadership, religious beliefs that differ fundamentally, and ways of life that are as different from each other as European nations are from each other. You might be Lakota, Iroquois, Cherokee, Navajo, Pueblo, Choctaw, Seminole, or any of hundreds of other distinct peoples whose territories, lifestyles, and cultures vary so dramatically that they might as well be different civilizations. The language being spoken around you offers no help in identification because you don't speak any indigenous languages and can't distinguish between the 300 distinct language families that exist across the Americas, representing thousands of years of linguistic divergence. The sounds are completely foreign. The grammatical structures are unlike Indo-European languages you might have studied in school, and you have no baseline for even identifying which language family you're hearing or how it relates to neighboring language. Your gender in this society will dramatically affect your daily activities, expectations, and survival strategies in ways that modern people find difficult to accept. If you're male, you'll be expected to hunt large game, engage in warfare when necessary, provide physical protection for the community, and procure protein through dangerous activities that could kill you. If you're female, you'll be expected to gather plant foods, process hides and materials, make clothing and shelter, handle domestic responsibilities, and manage the agricultural work that actually provides most of the community's calorie. Both roles require specialized skills you don't possess, but the specific skill deficits will vary based on gendered division of labor that you cannot opt out of regardless of your modern attitudes about gender equality. And then there's the geographical reality that will determine your survival difficulty level. Your location determines your survival difficulty. If you're with Plains tribes, your survival depends on successfully hunting mass dangerous buffalo, while competing with grizzly bears for resources and managing extreme temperature variations between summer heat that can cause deadly dehydration and winter cold that can kill unprepared people in hours through hypothermia or frostbite. The Plains lifestyle requires exceptional physical fitness, expert tracking and hunting skills, ability to process massive amounts of meat and hide quickly before spoilage, and the mental fortitude to live with minimal shelter in exposed landscapes where weather is a constant threat to life and comfort. The buffalo hunt itself is terrifyingly dangerous. These are animals that weigh up to 2,000 pounds, can run at 35 miles per hour, and will gore or trample hunters who make mistakes in approach or killing technique. Before horses arrived with Spanish colonization, which hasn't happened yet, buffalo hunting involves either driving herds over cliffs or approaching on foot with primitive weapons, both strategies requiring perfect coordination, courage, and acceptance of high casualty rates among hunters. If you're with woodland tribes in the eastern forests, your survival involves navigating dense forests with limited visibility where you can easily get lost, managing relationships with multiple neighboring tribes who might be allies or enemies, depending on complex diplomatic situations you know nothing about, and mastering agricultural techniques for the Three Sisters crops, corn, squash, that provide the nutritional foundation for sedentary communities, but require extensive knowledge of planting schedules, soil management, and pest control to succeed. Woodland life offers more stable food sources through combination of agriculture, hunting, fishing, and gathering, but also involves more complex political dynamics with denser populations competing for resources. The Iroquois Confederacy, for example, is a sophisticated political alliance of 5 nations, with democratic decision-making processes, while other woodland groups are engaged in ongoing conflicts over territory, hunting rights, and historical grievances that can turn deadly without warning. If you're with Southwest Pueblo peoples in the desert regions, you're in an environment where water is precious and scarce. Agriculture requires sophisticated irrigation systems that took generations to develop, and multi-story stone and adobe dwellings represent architectural achievements that required organized labor, engineering knowledge, and social cooperation on scales that Europeans won't achieve for centuries. Pueblo life offers strong defensive positions against raids and stable communities with rich ceremonial traditions, but demands extensive knowledge of desert survival, water management, and the social cooperation necessary to maintain irrigation systems that everyone depends on. But regardless of which region you're in, certain universal realities apply to all indigenous peoples in full. Every community operates on subsistence economy where survival depends on constant labor that varies by season, intimate knowledge of local ecology that takes years to acquire, and cooperation within social networks that function as insurance systems against individual or family hardship when hunting fails or illness strikes. There are no safety nets, no welfare systems, no ways to survive without either contributing labor that benefits the community or having family obligations that require others to support you even when you're not productive. The population density is much lower than post-Columbian Americas will become because the catastrophic diseases brought by Europeans, smallpox, measles, typhus, and others that will kill 90% of indigenous populations within a century, haven't arrived yet. The stereotypical empty wilderness that European colonizers will claim to find is actually carefully managed landscape that has been shaped by thousands of years of indigenous land management practices, controlled burning that maintains productive ecosystems, and sophisticated ecological knowledge that prevents overexploitation of resources. Your community exists within complex networks of trade that move goods thousands of miles, diplomacy that maintains peace or prosecutes war based on elaborate protocols, and occasional warfare with neighboring peoples over resources, territory, or revenge for past wrong. The political landscape is sophisticated and dangerous, with alliances and rivalries that shift based on resource availability, marriage relationships that create kinship obligation, and historical grievances that you know nothing about but which could get you killed if you violate diplomatic protocols or ally with the wrong groups accidentally. And your inability to read these social and political dynamics makes you vulnerable in ways you can't even recognize yet. Jill Tribal Culture Crash Course. You know nothing. Indigenous cultures in 1491 have sophisticated systems of government, law, religion, art, medicine, and social organization that rival or exceed European societies in complexity, effectiveness, and sometimes humanity. The Iroquois Confederacy operates on democratic principles, with women holding significant political power in ways that European women won't achieve for centuries, and their governmental structure will eventually influence the US Constitution's framers. Cahokia, at its peak, had a larger population than London and featured massive earthwork constructions that required organized labor and engineering knowledge that Europeans consistently underestimate. The Aztec Empire controls vast territories with administrative sophistication, military organization, and architectural achievements comparable to any Old World empire. The Inca road system spans thousands of miles through some of the world's most difficult terrain, facilitating communication and trade across an empire larger than any European state. The Maya have mathematical and astronomical knowledge that surpasses European understanding in some areas, including the concept of zero, which Europeans are still learning from Arabic sources. But you know virtually none of this cultural complexity, because your education taught you stereotypes about primitive Indians living in harmony with nature, without recognizing the advanced civilizations, complex society, and sophisticated knowledge systems that existed throughout the Americas for thousands of years before European contact. Your ignorance of actual indigenous cultures is so complete that you can't even recognize what you don't know, making every interaction a potential crisis. Every social interaction involves navigating unspoken rules about appropriate behavior, respect, generosity, and social obligation that vary dramatically between tribes. Looking someone directly in the eyes might be respectful and show attention in some cultures, or be aggressive and disrespectful in others, particularly when directed toward elders or authority figures. Accepting or refusing offered food carries social meanings beyond simple preference. Refusing hospitality can be grave insult, but accepting when resources are scarce creates obligations you might not be able to fulfill. But the crash course in cultural competence begins immediately whether you're ready or not. Your first major cultural lesson comes when you're included in a communal meal, where food is distributed according to social rules that reflect status, age, gender, and relationship in ways that seem arbitrary to you but carry deep meaning to participants. You wait and watch, trying to figure out when and how you're supposed to participate, terrified of committing some grave offense that would mark you as socially incompetent or disrespectful of traditions that everyone else understands instinctively. The concept of private property works completely differently than in modern Western culture in ways that will cause you constant confusion. Some things are personally owned and touching them without permission is theft. Others are communal, and refusing to share is antisocial behavior. And the boundaries between categories follow logic that's opaque to you because it's based on cultural values and practical considerations you don't understand. Taking or using something that seems available might actually be serious violation of someone's rights, while refusing to share something you think of as yours might mark you as selfish or antisocial in ways that damage your reputation permanently. Time operates on natural cycles rather than mechanical schedules. Days are organized by sunlight and seasonal activities rather than hours and minutes that don't exist yet. There are no clocks, no calendars in the modern sense, no way to measure time precisely beyond observing sun position phases and seasonal changes that indigenous peoples have tracked for thousands of years through accumulated astronomical knowledge encoded in oral traditions and physical monuments. Your question what time is literally meaningless in a culture where time is relative to natural phenomena rather than arbitrary numerical divisions. And just when you think you're starting to understand the basics, you realize that language learning is going to be even harder than you imagine. Communicating without words, good luck. The language barrier is absolute and terrifying in ways that modern people who've never experienced true linguistic isolation can't fully appreciate or imagine. You cannot say hello, thank you, help, water, I'm scared, or any other word that would allow basic communication beyond pointing and grunting. You're functionally mute in a community where language is essential for social participation, learning, survival, and being recognized as a full human rather than some kind of damaged or possessed individual who might need spiritual intervention. Indigenous languages in 1491 are linguistically diverse in ways that exceed European linguistic variation dramatically. Some are polysynthetic languages, creating entire sentences in single words through complex morphology that combines roots, prefixes, suffixes, and infixes in ways that make German compound words look simple. Others use tonal distinctions where pitch changes meaning entirely. The same sound at different pitches might mean mother or horse or death. Many have sounds that don't exist in European languages, making them literally impossible for untrained English speakers to pronounce accurately without years of practice and possibly physical training of mouth and throat muscles. Your attempts at communication default to gestures, which work for immediate physical needs, but fail completely for abstract concepts, questions, explanations, or anything requiring more sophistication than pointing at objects and miming actions like eating or sleeping. You can indicate hunger by pointing to your stomach, thirst by pointing to water, cold by hugging yourself and shivering, pain by touching the affected area and grimacing. You cannot explain who you are, ask for complex information about your situation, or participate in social conversations that build relationships and demonstrate that you're worth keeping around despite being completely useless at everything. But the people around you are trying to teach you their language, though their pedagogical methods don't match modern language instruction in any way. Children especially seem fascinated by your linguistic incompetence and take it upon themselves to teach you words through a combination of pointing, repetition, and patient correction when you inevitably mangle their language with your clumsy tongue that's trained for completely different phonemes. They giggle at your pronunciation errors in ways that are humiliating but also strangely encouraging because at least they're engaging with you rather than avoiding you as dangerous or hopeless. Their laughter, while embarrassing, indicates that they find you amusing rather than threatening, which is probably better for your survival than being viewed with suspicion or fear. Adults are less patient with your linguistic incompetence, but more systematic in their teaching approach, using language in context of daily activities, so you learn words for tools, actions, foods, and people through association with the things themselves, rather than through abstract grammar lessons. You learn water by being handed water containers, fire by tending fires under supervision, meat by helping process game animals, yes and no through repeated interactions where your responses are either accepted or correct. The immersion is total and exhausting, requiring constant mental effort to associate sounds with meanings without the benefit of translation dictionaries, structured lessons, or any way to ask for clarification when you're confused. The grammar is where things get truly difficult and where your progress slows dramatically. Word order, verb conjugations, noun declensions, and grammatical gender systems, if applicable to this particular language, follow patterns that are completely different from English, and which you can't just intuit from vocabulary knowledge. You can't simply plug in vocabulary words to English sentence structures and hope to be understood. You need to internalize entirely new ways of organizing linguistic information that don't map onto your native language category. And this restructuring of how you think about language takes months or years rather than days or weeks. And certain concepts that are important in indigenous cultures don't have simple English equivalents, making them especially hard to learn and understand. Some indigenous languages encode information about the source of knowledge, whether you witnessed something directly, heard about it from others, or are making an assumption based on indirect evidence, directly into verb forms in ways that English doesn't require. You can't just say it rained, you have to specify whether you saw it rain, heard it raining, or concluded it rained from seeing wet ground. This grammatical requirement forces you to be precise about epistemology in ways that English speakers aren't accustomed to considering. Other languages make grammatical distinctions between animate and inanimate objects, but the categories don't match English intuitions. Stones might be animate, hair might be inanimate, and the grammatical treatment of objects reflects spiritual worldview that sees personhood in things that Western culture considers mere objects. Learning these categories requires internalizing spiritual concepts about the nature of reality, not just memorizing vocabulary lists. Kinship terms are often far more specific than English relatives, with different words for maternal versus paternal relatives, older versus younger siblings, and relationship categories that don't exist in English at all. You can't just say my uncle. You need to specify which type of uncle, what your relationship obligations are to that category of person, and potentially what social behaviors are appropriate based on kinship category. Learning kinship vocabulary requires understanding entire social systems, not just memorizing words. Learning through observation and embarrassment. Your language education involves constant embarrassment as you make mistakes that range from merely awkward to potentially offensive, or even dangerous if you say the wrong thing in wrong context. You confuse words with similar sounds but completely different meanings, use wrong verb forms that change meaning entirely, accidentally say things that don't mean what you intended, and generally sound like a confused toddler who knows just enough language to create humorous or concerning misunderstandings that damage your reputation and social standing. The hardest part is that you can't ask for clarification or explanation in ways that would help you understand your mistakes when you make them. When people laugh or look confused or offended at something you've said, you don't know what you did wrong, how severe the error was, or how to fix it going forward. You're learning through trial and error without the feedback mechanisms that make error correction efficient in structured language education with teachers who can explain mistakes in your native language. Gender-specific language variations, if present in this particular indigenous language, create additional complications that you don't even recognize at first. Some words or speech patterns are appropriate for one gender but not the other, and using the wrong gendered forms marks you as linguistically incompetent in ways that might have social consequences. You might be inadvertently using feminine speech patterns as a male speaker or vice versa, marking yourself as someone who doesn't understand basic social categories that even children master early. Honorific forms and respectful speech registers that you're supposed to use when addressing elders, chiefs, shamans, or other high-status individuals are another linguistic minefield. Using casual speech with someone who deserves respectful forms is grave insult that could seriously damage your social standing or even create enemies who might harm you later. But you don't know who deserves what speech register, when to switch between forms, or even that these categories exist until you've already offended someone important. But slowly, painfully, through thousands of repetitions and corrections, basic vocabulary begins to stick in your memory. After days or weeks of intensive immersion where you hear nothing but this language from dawn to dusk, you can finally express basic needs and understand simple commands. You know words for common objects: water, food, fire, knife, clothing, basic actions: eat, sleep, go, come, help. Essential people: mother, father, child, elder, friend, enemy, and immediate needs: hungry, cold, tired, hurt, help, stop. You're functioning at roughly the linguistic level of a 3-year-old, which is simultaneously progress worth celebrating and a humiliating reminder of how far you have to go before you can participate in adult conversations or demonstrate the intelligence you actually possess. Understanding spoken language remains much harder than producing simple utterances, because people speak at normal conversational speed without slowing down for your benefit. When people speak at normal pace, the words blur together into incomprehensible streams of sound from which you might catch one or two familiar words without understanding the overall meaning or context. You nod and smile and pretend to comprehend more than you actually do, while actually being completely lost, hoping context clues and situational awareness will prevent you from responding inappropriately to questions or commands you didn't actually understand. The social isolation of not fully understanding language is psychologically crushing in ways that solitary confinement never approached. You're surrounded by people but cannot participate in their conversations, jokes, stories, gossip, or social bonding activities that depend on linguistic participation and shared cultural references. You're functionally excluded from community life in ways that are more isolating than physical solitude, because you can see the connections and relationships you're unable to access, watching social bonding happen around you while remaining perpetually outside looking in. And then you make a gesture that means something completely different in this culture than what you intended. Every gesture could be an insult. Non-verbal communication that seems universal actually varies dramatically across cultures in ways that can turn friendly gestures into grave insults. And you discover this the hard way when you make what you think is a friendly gesture that turns out to be insulting, threatening, or sexually inappropriate in this cultural context. The shocked reactions and immediate social distancing make clear you've done something seriously wrong, but without language to explain or apologize properly, you can only look confused and hope that your obvious ignorance excuses the offense rather than compounding it. Eye contact norms are particularly tricky and vary dramatically between indigenous cultures. In some tribes, direct eye contact shows respect, attention, and honesty. Avoiding someone's gaze suggests you're lying or disrespectful. In other cultures, direct eye contact is aggressive, disrespectful, or sexually forward, particularly when directed toward elders, authority figures, or members of opposite sex. You're constantly unsure whether you should look at people when they speak to you or avert your gaze respectfully, and you're probably getting it wrong most of the time based on people's reactions, damaging relationships without even realizing how or why. Physical touch follows rules that are opaque to you and which vary based on relationship, gender, age, and context in ways you can't begin to untangle. Who can you touch? In what contexts? What kind of touch is appropriate between different categories of people? Touching someone's head might be grave insult because that's where the soul resides. Touching someone's possessions without permission might be theft. Touching someone of opposite sex might be sexual advance or grave violation of propriety. You're terrified of accidentally touching someone inappropriately or failing to make expected physical contact in situations where it signals relationship, respect, or shared grief. Personal space expectations are completely different from modern Western norms and vary between cultures. Some indigenous peoples stand much closer during conversations than Anglo-Americans find comfortable, while others maintain greater distance. Standing too close might be aggressive or sexually forward, while standing too far might be cold or disrespectful. You're constantly adjusting your position based on others' reactions, never quite getting it right, marked as someone who doesn't understand basic social spacing that children master unconsciously. But the most dangerous miscommunications involve religious or spiritual matters that you can't even recognize as such. Certain words, names, or concepts might be sacred, taboo, or dangerous to speak in ways that aren't obvious to outsiders who don't understand spiritual framework. You might accidentally say something that's religiously offensive, use a name that shouldn't be spoken casually, like speaking the name of deceased person before proper mourning period ends, or refer to spiritual matters in ways that violate protocols you're completely unaware of. These religious violations could have serious consequences, including social ostracism, required purification rituals, or worse depending on how seriously the offense is viewed and whether it suggests spiritual contamination or malevolent influence. Your modern secular worldview makes you insensitive to spiritual dimensions of daily life that are integral to indigenous cultures where the boundary between physical and spiritual worlds is permeable. You don't recognize when activities are ritual rather than practical, when objects are sacred rather than simply functional, or when behaviors are religiously prescribed rather than merely customary. Your spiritual illiteracy creates constant risk of offending beliefs you don't even know exist, potentially marking you as spiritually dangerous or contaminated in ways that could lead to your exile or worse. And all of this communication difficulty is compounded by the fact that you're trying to function in a society with completely different social structures, gender roles, and daily activities that you know nothing about and must somehow learn to navigate while people are watching you suspiciously and wondering what's wrong with you. And that's when you discover that your gender determines basically your entire existence in ways that modern people can barely comprehend. Men hunt, women gather. Gender roles in indigenous societies in 1491 are not suggestions or social conventions that individuals can ignore if they prefer different activities. They're fundamental organizing principles that structure work, social status, spiritual practices, and essentially every aspect of daily life in ways that are non-negotiable. The division of labor by gender isn't about oppression or discrimination in the modern sense. It's about survival efficiency developed over thousands of years of trial and error in environments where mistakes mean death. If you're male, you're expected to hunt large game animals that provide crucial protein and materials, engage in warfare when tribal conflicts arise, provide physical protection for the community against human and animal threats, and perform heavy labor like clearing land or building structures. These aren't optional activities you can decline if you don't feel like it. They're fundamental responsibilities that define masculine identity and social value. A man who cannot or will not hunt is essentially useless in this society, unable to fulfill his basic obligations to family and community. The hunt itself is terrifyingly dangerous in ways that modern people who buy meat in plastic packages cannot comprehend. You're tracking animals that can kill you: buffalo, elk, deer, bear, using weapons that require getting close enough to stab or shoot with arrows that might not penetrate deeply enough to bring down an animal that will then attack you with its dying strength. Hunting involves tracking skills you don't possess, understanding animal behavior you've never studied, physical endurance you haven't developed, and willingness to risk death that your safe modern life has never required. But hunting isn't just about bringing home meat, it's about proving your masculinity and worth. Young men establish their status through hunting prowess, demonstrating to potential wives and their families that they can provide, showing other men that they're competent and brave, and proving to themselves that they're full adults capable of fulfilling masculine responsibility. Your inability to hunt competently marks you as lesser, dependent, possibly unfit for marriage or full community membership. You're essentially a boy in a man's body, unable to do the things that define manhood in this culture. If you're female, you're expected to gather plant foods that actually provide most of the community's calories, process hides and materials that men bring back from hunts, make clothing that everyone depends on for survival, handle agricultural work in tribes that practice farm, manage domestic tasks including cooking and childcare, and perform the continuous labor that keeps everyone alive day to day. These responsibilities aren't lesser than men's work, they're different but equally essential, and women who cannot perform these tasks are as useless as men who cannot hunt. Gathering requires extensive botanical knowledge to identify hundreds of edible plants, distinguish poisonous from nutritious species, know when and where different plants are available seasonally, and process raw plant materials into food that won't make people sick. You don't have this knowledge. You can't tell edible berries from poisonous ones, don't know which roots are safe to eat or how to prepare them, and would probably poison yourself or others if left to gather food independent. But the worst part is that you can't just choose the gender role that seems easier. Gender roles are assigned at birth, usually, and enforced through social pressure, spiritual belief and practical necessity. If you're physically male, trying to do women's work marks you as wrong, strange, possibly spiritually contaminated. If you're physically female, attempting men's work marks you as either spiritually exceptional or as someone who doesn't understand proper behavior. You cannot opt out of gendered expectations regardless of your modern beliefs about gender equality or personal preferences about what work you prefer to do. The clothing you wear, the tools you use, the spaces you occupy, the conversations you participate in, all are gendered in ways that might seem arbitrary to modern people but which carry deep meaning about identity, propriety, and cosmic order. Wearing opposite gender clothing without specific spiritual justification would be shocking violation of norms. Using opposite gender tools might be ritual contamination. Entering opposite gender spaces uninvited could be serious offense. Your modern notion that anyone should be able to do any job regardless of gender doesn't exist here, and wouldn't make sense in context where survival depends on specialized skills developed through decades of practice starting in childhood. The division of labor isn't about discrimination, it's about efficiency and expertise in economy, where there's no room for generalists who do everything poorly rather than specialists who do specific things expert. And then you discover that there's actually a third gender category you knew nothing about. Your gender determines your entire life. The gendered division of space means that certain areas are men's territory and others are women's territory in ways that aren't just about bathroom. Men's gathering areas where they make tools, discuss hunting plans and conduct masculine rituals are off limits to women except in specific circumstances. Women's working areas where they process foods, make clothing and conduct feminine rituals are similarly restricted to women except for young boys who haven't yet transitioned to men's world. Your sleeping arrangements, eating positions, working locations, all are determined by gender. In many tribes, men and women eat separately or in specific spatial arrangements that reflect gender hierarchy or complementarity depending on the culture's specific beliefs. You can't just sit anywhere or eat with anyone. You need to position yourself appropriately based on your gender, age and status in ways that you don't understand but which everyone else reads instinctively. Decision-making processes are often gendered, with men controlling some types of decisions and women controlling others. In many tribes, men make decisions about warfare, hunting and external relations while women control domestic decisions, agricultural planning and sometimes have veto power over men's decisions through councils or individual influence. The Iroquois, for example, have clan mothers who select male chiefs and can remove them if they fail to serve the people properly, a level of female political power that European women won't achieve for centuries. But gender roles aren't just about work and space, they're also about spiritual power and cosmic order. Many indigenous cultures believe that men and women have different spiritual powers that must be kept separate in certain contexts to avoid spiritual contamination or imbalance. Menstruating women are often segregated because their powerful spiritual state could interfere with hunting, magic, war preparations or sacred objects. This isn't about considering women dirty or inferior, it's about respecting feminine spiritual power that's so strong it needs to be managed carefully. Male spiritual practices often involve vision quests, sweat lodges, warrior rituals and hunting magic that women cannot participate in without spiritual danger. Female spiritual practices involve their own powerful rituals around fertility, agriculture, healing and life transitions that men are excluded from for similar reasons. The spiritual segregation isn't about discrimination, it's about maintaining cosmic balance between complementary forces that need to remain distinct. Your inability to perform gender-appropriate spiritual practices marks you as spiritually deficient or possibly dangerous. If you're male and cannot successfully complete a vision quest, you might never be fully recognized as a man. If you're female and don't undergo proper coming-of-age rituals around first menstruation, your transition to womanhood might be incomplete in ways that affect your marriage prospects and social status. And just when you think you understand the gender system, you discover there are exceptions that complicate everything.
Thick two-spirit people. The third gender. You didn't expect. Many indigenous cultures recognize third and sometimes fourth gender categories for people who don't fit into binary masculine-feminine roles. Individuals known in modern terminology as two-spirit people, though this specific term is a recent pan-Indian invention, and historical terms varied by culture. These are people who were typically assigned male at birth, but who dress, work, and live as women, or less commonly people assigned female who take on masculine roles and appearance. Two-spirit individuals aren't just tolerated. In many tribes they're respected as specially gifted people who can see from both masculine and feminine perspectives, giving them unique spiritual insights. They might become shamans, mediators, or hold other special positions that utilize their liminal status. Far from the homophobia that Europeans will bring, many indigenous cultures recognize that human gender and sexuality are more complex than simple binary. But becoming a two-spirit person isn't a choice you can just make because you prefer opposite gender work. Two-spirit identity typically involves spiritual calling, often revealed through dreams, visions, or childhood behaviors that suggest spiritual designation for this role. It's not about personal preference or modern concepts of transgender identity. It's about spiritual calling that's recognized by community and shamans as indication that the person has special spiritual nature requiring different gender expression. If you tried to claim two-spirit status without proper spiritual credentials, you'd probably be rejected as someone who's confused or trying to avoid gender-appropriate responsibility. The recognition process involves community validation, spiritual confirmation, and often specific rituals that mark the transition to two-spirit status. You can't just decide you don't want to hunt anymore so you'll be two-spirit instead. It doesn't work that way. The existence of two-spirit people demonstrates that indigenous cultures understand human diversity in ways that are sophisticated and accepting in some respects. But the systems are still rigid in requiring everyone to fit into recognized categories, rather than allowing complete gender fluidity. You need to be recognizably male, female, or two-spirit. There's no option for being undefined or rejecting gender categories entirely. And regardless of which gender category you're in, you're about to discover that food acquisition is a constant, exhausting struggle. No grocery stores, no refrigeration, no problem. The most immediate and constant concern in 1491 is food, acquiring it, processing it, preserving it, and consuming enough calories to fuel the intense physical labor that daily survival requires. There are no grocery stores, no restaurants, no food delivery, no refrigerators, and no safety net if you fail to secure adequate nutrition. You eat what you can hunt, gather, grow, or trade for, and if those sources fail, you starve. It's that simple and that terrifying. Your modern body is accustomed to eating whenever you're hungry, consuming processed foods that require no preparation beyond opening packages, and having access to thousands of calories with minimal effort. You've never experienced true hunger, the kind that gnaws at your stomach day after day, weakens your body until simple tasks become exhausting, and occupies your thoughts constantly as you fantasize about foods you might never taste again. In contrast, indigenous peoples in 1491 spend most of their waking hours on food-related activities: hunting, fishing, gathering, processing, preserving, cooking. Food acquisition isn't something you do occasionally when groceries run low. It's the central organizing activity of daily life that determines where you live, when you move, what tools you make, and how you structure your social relationship. Everything revolves around food because without constant effort to secure it, you die. But it's not just about having enough food, it's about having the right kinds of food. Human nutrition requires balanced intake of proteins, carbohydrates, fats, vitamins, and minerals that you won't get from eating just one type of food. Indigenous peoples understand this through accumulated experience even without modern nutritional science, developing seasonal diets that provide necessary nutrients through combinations of foods available at different times of year. The Three Sisters agriculture of corn, beans, and squash, for example, provides complete protein and complementary nutrients that support human health better than any single crop alone. Your modern body is adapted to processed foods with added vitamins, refined sugars and abundant fats. Suddenly switching to pre-agricultural or early agricultural diet will cause digestive distress, energy crashes, and probably weight loss as your body adjusts to foods it's not prepared for. You might experience constant diarrhea from high-fiber plant foods, nausea from the meat-heavy diet of hunting cultures, or dangerous calorie deficiency if you can't consume enough of the nutrient-dense but not always filling traditional food. The seasonal variation in food availability means that you might eat abundantly during certain times of year when game is plentiful and plants are producing, but face potential starvation during late winter and early spring, when stored foods run low and new growth hasn't started yet. The starving time in late winter, early spring, is real crisis that kills weak individuals and requires the strong to survive on minimal calories while hoping for early spring growth, or successful hunting. And acquiring food requires skills you don't have and dangers you've never faced.
Buffalo, corn, and whatever else you can find. If you're in a plains tribe, buffalo hunting provides the foundation of survival. These massive animals provide meat, hides for clothing and shelter, bones for tools, sinew for thread, and essentially everything else needed for life on the grasslands. But hunting buffalo is terrifyingly dangerous and requires coordination, courage, and skills that you don't possess, and might never fully develop even with training. Before horses arrived with Spanish colonization, which hasn't happened yet, buffalo hunting involves either driving herds over cliffs through coordinated group effort where mistakes can get people killed, or stalking individual animals on foot using disguises and getting close enough for bow shots, or spear thrusts, but must penetrate the thick hide and hit vital organs or the wounded animal will kill you with its horns and hooves. The casualty rate among hunters is significant. Buffalo kills humans regularly, and the community accepts these deaths as necessary cost of survival. If you're in an agricultural tribe practicing corn, beans, squash farming, your survival depends on successful growing season, which requires knowledge of planting schedules, soil preparation, weeding, pest control, and harvest timing that you don't have. Farming in 1491 is nothing like modern agriculture with machinery, pesticides, and hybrid seeds. It's hard manual labor using stone or wooden tools, constant vigilance against pests and thieves, and acceptance that crop failures happen regularly due to drought, floods, or other factors beyond human control. But most tribes practice mixed subsistence strategies combining hunting, gathering, and sometimes agriculture. Gathering wild plant foods requires extensive botanical knowledge to identify hundreds of species, know which parts are edible and when they're available, understand processing methods that remove toxins or improve digestibility, and remember locations where productive plants grow so you can return when they're ready for harvest. Indigenous women who specialize in gathering carry knowledge in their heads that would fill botanical textbooks. They're expert botanists through practical experience rather than formal education. You don't have this knowledge and will need years to acquire even basic competence at gathering. You can't distinguish edible berries from poisonous ones by sight alone, don't know which roots are nutritious versus toxic, and might kill yourself or others by gathering beautiful but deadly plants that you think look safe. Your gathering efforts will need constant supervision by experts who correct your mistakes and prevent you from bringing home things that would poison the entire group. Fishing provides crucial protein for tribes near rivers, lakes, or coasts, using techniques ranging from simple hook and line to sophisticated weirs and traps that require engineering knowledge and cooperative labor to construct and maintain. You don't know how to make fishing line from plant fibers, carve hooks from bone, construct traps that actually catch fish, or identify productive fishing locations and seasons. Your fishing efforts would be largely unsuccessful without guidance, and even when you successfully acquire food, processing it requires additional skills you lack. Food preservation without modern technology. Raw meat spoils within hours in warm weather, requiring immediate processing to prevent waste of hard-won food. Indigenous peoples use multiple preservation techniques that you've never practiced and don't fully understand. Smoking, drying, making pemmican, dried meat mixed with fat and berries, and storing in underground caches that protect from animals and moderate temperature. Smoking meat involves building and maintaining specialized structures, managing fire and smoke to cure meat without cooking it too fast or leaving it raw, and preventing contamination while meat hangs for days. The process requires constant attention and expertise to judge when meat is properly preserved versus underpreserved, will spoil, or overpreserved, becomes too hard to eat. Your attempts at smoking meat without guidance would probably result in wasted food that spoils or burns. Making pemmican is crucial for surviving winter and for travel when fresh food isn't available. The mixture of dried meat, rendered fat and dried berries provides concentrated nutrition that stores for months without spoiling, but making it requires rendering fat to correct consistency, drying meat to right moisture level, and mixing in proportions that create stable product rather than something that separates or molds. The technique takes practice to master, and mistakes waste precious resources. Plant foods also require processing and preservation, grinding corn into meal, leaching tannins from our corns, drying berries, and storing everything in ways that prevent spoilage, moisture damage, insect infestation, or theft by rodents. Each type of food has specific storage requirements and traditional methods that work through accumulated experience. Your modern assumption that you can just put things in containers and they'll keep is dangerously wrong. But the most psychologically difficult aspect of food in 1491 is accepting that hunger is normal. Indigenous peoples don't eat until they're full 3 times per day like modern Americans. They eat when food is available, sometimes abundantly and sometimes sparingly, accepting hunger as normal condition rather than emergency requiring immediate remedy. Feast and famine cycles are natural rhythm of life, not signs of failure or crisis. Bodies adapt to intermittent eating patterns that would seem like starvation to modern people accustomed to constant food availability. Your modern expectation of eating whenever you want whatever you want will be completely frustrated by realities of subsistence living where meals are small, repetitive and sometimes skipped entirely when food is scarce. You'll go to sleep hungry regularly, wake up hungry frequently, and work hard physical labor while hungry more often than you're comfortable with. This is normal, and complaining about it marks you as soft and unrealistic about survival requirement. The psychological adjustment to food scarcity is one of the hardest transitions for modern people, harder in some ways than physical labor or language barriers. Food anxiety, worrying about whether there will be enough, whether you'll contribute adequately to acquisition, whether you'll be fed if you're not productive, becomes constant mental burden that indigenous peoples manage through cultural practices and spiritual beliefs that you don't share. And while you're struggling with constant hunger and food anxiety, you'll also need to navigate the completely foreign landscape of courtship and sexuality in a culture nothing like modern dating. How to impress someone without Tinder. Courtship in indigenous societies follows elaborate protocols that seem both more formal and more flexible than modern dating, depending on the specific tribe and situation. There's no Tinder, no online dating, no way to swipe through potential partners while sitting safely behind screen. Romantic and sexual relationships develop through face-to-face interactions, governed by cultural rules about appropriate behavior, supervision, and the involvement of families who have significant say in marriage decisions. If you're male and interested in a woman, you can't just ask her out on a date. You need to demonstrate your worth through hunting success, generosity to her family, displays of courage or skill, and adherence to courtship protocols that might involve intermediaries, gifts or ritual performances. A man who cannot hunt successfully or provide gifts has nothing to offer and won't be taken seriously as marriage prospect, regardless of personality or other qualities that modern dating might value. If you're female and interested in a man, you have some agency in accepting or rejecting suitors, but the degree of choice varies dramatically between cultures. Some tribes allow women significant voice in choosing partners while others involve arranged marriages, where family interests outweigh individual preferences. Even in cultures where women choose freely, their choices are constrained by practical considerations about which men can actually provide, protect, and fulfill masculine responsibilities necessary for family survival. But courtship isn't just about two individuals, it's about families, clans, and sometimes political alliances. Marriage in 1491 is economic partnership and alliance between families, as much as romantic relationship between individuals. Families evaluate potential in-laws based on their ability to contribute to extended family survival, their social standing in community, their clan affiliation, avoiding marriages between people too closely related, and their history of fulfilling obligation. A marriage isn't just between two people, it creates a network of reciprocal obligations between families who will support each other in times of need. The concept of falling in love exists, but it's tempered by practical considerations that modern romanticism ignores. Love might develop before or after marriage, but it's not the only or even primary criterion for choosing spouse. Compatibility, productivity, family connections, and practical partnership are equally or more important. The Western ideal of marrying purely for love without considering practical compatibility would seem irresponsible and potentially disastrous to indigenous peoples who understand that survival depends on choosing partners who can actually fulfill necessary roles. Your modern notion of serial dating, living together before marriage, or breaking up casually when relationships don't work out, doesn't map onto indigenous courtship, where marriages are serious commitments with social and economic implications beyond the couple themselves. Families invest in their children's marriages, providing gifts and resources to help new couples establish themselves, and they expect those investments to produce stable partnerships that contribute to extended family welfare. And then there's the question of what physical intimacy looks like in a culture with completely different privacy norms: arranged marriages, love marriages, or both. Some tribes practice arranged marriages where parents or extended family choose spouses based on family interests, while others allow young people to choose their own partners with family approval. Many tribes fall somewhere in between, with family input strongly influencing but not absolutely controlling marriage decisions. The specific customs vary dramatically between cultures, but none match modern Western expectations of complete individual choice without family involvement or consideration of practical matters. Arranged marriages aren't necessarily loveless or oppressive. Families try to make good matches that will produce stable partnerships, and many arranged marriages develop deep affection and compatibility over time. The arrangement process often involves extended courtship period where young people can get to know each other before finalizing commitment, and marriages can be dissolved if they prove incompatible, though divorce carries social complications and practical challenges that make it serious decision rather than casual option. Love matches that defy family wishes do happen, but they're complicated by the fact that marriage without family support makes survival much harder. Young couples depend on extended family networks for labor sharing, resource pooling, and survival insurance that you can't manage alone. Marrying against family wishes means losing access to those support systems, making independent marriage extremely difficult unless the couple is exceptionally capable and willing to accept social marginalization. But marriage customs include practices that would shock modern sensibility: polygamy, divorce, and tribal romance rules. Some tribes practice polygamy, usually polygamy where successful men might have multiple wives if they can support them, though polyandry, multiple husbands, exists in some cultures as well. Polygamous marriages aren't harems of sexual gratification but rather economic partnerships where co-wives share labor, support each other, and benefit from pooled resources that allow the household to be more productive and secure than individual nuclear families could manage alone. A man's first wife often has to approve additional wives, and co-wives are frequently sisters or close relatives who already have established relationships and can cooperate effectively. The choice to become second or third wife might seem degrading from modern perspective, but for women in cultures where marriage options are limited by demographics or where being unmarried means lacking access to male labor for hunting and protection, becoming a junior wife might be a better option than remaining single or marrying less capable man as his only wife. Divorce exists, but it's complicated. In some cultures, divorce is relatively easy, with either party able to dissolve marriage and divide property according to established customs, while in others divorce is difficult and stigmatized, requiring serious justification and leaving divorced individuals in difficult social positions. Divorced women might return to their birth families, remarry, or in some cases live independently, which is rare and difficult. Divorced men might lose access to their children, who typically stay with mother's family. And then there's sexuality itself, which is regulated by cultural rules that might surprise you. Sexual behavior before marriage ranges from strictly prohibited to relatively permissive depending on the culture. Some tribes allow young people sexual freedom before marriage, recognizing that experimenting and learning about compatibility is useful preparation for partnership. Other tribes strictly control premarital sexuality, particularly for women, with violations carrying serious social consequences, including punishment, forced marriage to avoid shame, or permanent damage to marriage prospect. Same-sex relationships and sexuality exist in various forms across indigenous cultures. Some tribes have relatively accepting attitudes toward same-sex partnerships, while others restrict same-sex sexuality through religious beliefs or social taboo. The presence of two-spirit people in many cultures indicates sophisticated understanding that sexuality and gender are more complex than simple heterosexual binaries, though two-spirit identity doesn't map directly onto modern LGBTQ categories and shouldn't be simplified into claims that all indigenous cultures were uniformly accepting of all sexual diversity. Your modern attitudes about sexuality, consent, privacy, and relationships will likely clash with cultural norms that govern sexual behavior through religious beliefs, gender segregation, family oversight, and social consequences for violation. The concept of casual sex with strangers or acquaintances might be completely foreign or might be incorporated into specific ritual context, depending on the culture. You can't assume that your modern sexual ethics will be understood or accepted, and if you do marry and have children, you'll discover that parenting in 1491 is nothing like modern child rearing.
Children are not coddled like modern kids. Indigenous child rearing practices would shock modern parents who obsess over safety, supervision and constant engagement with children. Kids in 1491 have tremendous autonomy and responsibility from young ages, learning through observation and participation in adult activities rather than through formal education or protective coddling that shields them from risk and failure. Children as young as 4 or 5 are expected to contribute to family survival through age-appropriate tasks: gathering firewood, fetching water, watching younger siblings, helping with food preparation, learning to use tools and weapons. By ages 8 to 10, children are doing serious work that contributes significantly to household productivity, and by early teens they're often competent at most adult tasks, even if they lack the experience and judgment that comes with more years. The autonomy given to children would terrify modern parents. Kids wander off to play without supervision, experiment with tools and weapons that could cause serious injury, take risks that modern parents would prevent, and generally learn through trial and error, including painful consequences that teach valuable lessons. The attitude isn't about neglect. Parents love their children deeply, but about recognizing that overprotecting children prevents them from developing the skills, confidence and resilience necessary for survival. But this autonomy comes with serious risks that modern parents have eliminated through constant supervision. Child injuries and deaths are far more common than in modern societies with safety regulations, emergency medical care, and protective parenting. Children drown in rivers, get burned by fires, fall from trees or cliffs, get bitten by snakes or attacked by animals, or suffer injuries from tools and weapons that modern parents wouldn't let kids anywhere near. The casualty rate is accepted as unfortunate but unavoidable cost of raising independent, capable adults who can survive in dangerous environment. Your modern instinct to protect children from all possible harm will mark you as anxiously overprotective in ways that other parents find puzzling or concerning. How will children learn if they're never allowed to take risks or make mistakes? Indigenous parents certainly protect small children from obvious dangers, but they also trust kids to develop judgment through experience, including sometimes painful consequences that teach more effectively than verbal warnings ever could. Physical punishment of children is used in some tribes but not others. Discipline methods vary culturally, but the general pattern is less physical punishment than many historical European societies, while also being less permissive than modern Western parenting that avoids any physical correction. Children learn through shame, modeling, natural consequences, and community involvement rather than primarily through physical punishment or timeouts. And education happens through participation, not schooling. Education through experience, not classrooms. There are no schools, no formal curriculum, no standardized testing. Children learn by watching adults and practicing skills until they achieve competence. Boys learn hunting, tool making, and masculine skills by accompanying men on hunts, helping make weapons, and practicing on small game before graduating to dangerous prey. Girls learn gathering, food processing, clothing construction, and feminine skills by helping women with daily tasks, starting with simple contributions and progressing to complex techniques as they mature. The educational system is remarkably efficient despite lacking formal structure. By early teenage years, most children are highly competent at the skills necessary for survival, more capable in practical terms than most modern adults, despite lacking literacy, mathematics, or other academic knowledge. The knowledge base is deep rather than broad, focused on specific skills necessary for survival in particular environment, rather than general education about topics that might not be practically useful. Storytelling serves as education about history, ethics, spiritual beliefs, and practical knowledge transmitted orally from generation to generation without writing. The stories contain lessons about behavior, warnings about dangers, explanations of natural phenomena, and entertainment that bonds community through shared narrative. Your inability to participate in this oral tradition, both because you don't know the stories and because your language skills are inadequate, excludes you from crucial educational and cultural experiences. But the most heartbreaking reality of childhood in 1490: high infant mortality rates. Heartbreaking reality: infant and child mortality rates are shockingly high by modern standards. Estimates suggest that 40 to 50% of children die before age 5 from diseases, injuries, birth complications or malnutrition that modern medicine prevents or treats. Losing children is normal rather than exceptional tragedy, and every parent expects that some of their babies won't survive to adulthood regardless of how much love and care they provide. The emotional reality of high child mortality is that parents must somehow balance deep love for their children with realistic acceptance that many will die, creating complex emotional relationships that modern parents with 99% pulse child survival rates can barely comprehend. Parents are simultaneously devoted to their children and emotionally prepared for possible death in ways that seem contradictory but which represent adaptive response to harsh realities of pre-modern life. Infant deaths especially are frequent enough that some cultures don't fully incorporate babies into community until they reach certain age or demonstrate survival viability, not because babies aren't loved, but because forming full emotional attachment to an infant who will likely die is psychologically unbearable. If repeated multiple times, the delayed naming or delayed social recognition isn't cruelty, it's protective mechanism that helps parents survive repeated losses without completely breaking down, and mothers face risks during pregnancy and childbirth that kill them regularly. Maternal mortality is also tragically common. Childbirth is dangerous without modern medical intervention, and complications that would be routinely managed in modern hospitals instead kill mothers regularly. A woman might successfully deliver several healthy babies and then die from hemorrhage, infection, or obstructed labor during a later birth that could have been saved with cesarean section or antibiotic. The risk of death during reproductive years means that many children lose their mothers, and communities must have systems for absorbing motherless children into extended families. Your knowledge of modern medicine and germ theory won't help much in preventing these deaths because you don't have antibiotics, surgical tools, blood transfusions, or any of the medical interventions that actually save lives. You might know that washing hands prevents infection, but convincing others to change traditional practices based on your explanation of invisible germs that they can't see or verify is nearly impossible. Your modern medical knowledge is mostly useless without modern medical technology to implement. The psychological impact of watching children and mothers die regularly from preventable causes will be traumatic for you in ways that indigenous peoples adapt to through spiritual beliefs, communal grieving practices, and acceptance of death as natural part of life rather than medical failure. Your modern expectation that everyone should survive childhood and childbirth will be constantly violated, and you'll grieve losses that the community mourns but also accepts as inevitable rather than tragic aberration. And all of this happens within spiritual framework that governs every aspect of life in ways you don't understand.
Everything has a spirit. Animism 101. Indigenous spiritual beliefs generally incorporate animism, the understanding that everything in the world has spiritual essence or personhood, not just humans and animals, but also plants, rocks, rivers, mountains, weather phenomena, and anything else that exists. This isn't primitive superstition, but rather sophisticated worldview that recognizes relationality and consciousness as fundamental aspects of reality that extend beyond the narrow category of human beings that Western philosophy privileges. The animals you hunt aren't mere resources, but persons with whom you have relationships. You must show respect, perform proper rituals, use all parts of the animal without waste, and acknowledge the spiritual exchange involved in taking a life to sustain your own. Hunting isn't just physical activity but spiritual transaction, requiring proper protocols that honor the animal's sacrifice and maintain good relationships with animal spirits who control whether future hunts succeed or fail. Plants similarly have spiritual essence requiring respectful treatment. You don't just take whatever you want, but rather ask permission, explain your need, leave offerings, and harvest in ways that don't damage the plant community or exhaust resources. Gathering isn't pure extraction, but rather participation in reciprocal relationship, where you're part of ecosystem rather than external exploiter. And maintaining these relationships requires spiritual practices that acknowledge your dependence on plant persons who sustain you. But this spiritual worldview means that your modern secular skepticism will be seen as spiritually dangerous. Your inability to see the spirits, feel their presence, or recognize spiritual dimensions of ordinary activities marks you as spiritually blind or damaged in ways that might explain your other incompetencies and strange behavior. If you cannot perceive spiritual reality that everyone else experiences as obvious, maybe you're spiritually contaminated, possessed, or fundamentally wrong in ways that require healing or intervention. The spiritual practices that seem like superstition to your modern scientific worldview, actually technologies for managing relationship with spiritual dimensions of reality, not because spirits don't exist, but because they do exist within indigenous epistemology, and ignoring them has real consequences within that framework. Your skepticism isn't enlightened rationality. It's spiritual illiteracy that makes you dangerous to yourself and potentially to others who might be affected by your violations of spiritual protocol. Natural phenomena aren't random or impersonal, but rather expressions of spiritual forces that have intentions, personalities, and relationships with humans. Storms might be angry spirits, droughts might be punishment for violations, good harvests might be rewards for proper behavior. This understanding requires living ethically and performing correct rituals to maintain good relationships with spiritual forces that control whether you survive or perish. And the people who mediate between human and spiritual worlds hold tremendous power. Shamans, vision quest, and talking to animals. Shamans, or medicine people, serve as intermediaries between human and spiritual worlds, wielding power that combines religious authority, medical knowledge, psychological counseling, and political influence in ways that make them some of the most important people in any community. They diagnose spiritual causes of illness, perform healing rituals, communicate with spirits, interpret dreams and visions, and guide the community in maintaining proper relationships with spiritual forces that determine survival and prosperity. Becoming a shaman isn't about choosing a career path. It's about being chosen by spirits through visions, dreams, near-death experiences, or other spiritual signs that mark certain individuals as having special connection to spiritual realm. The training is long and difficult, involving fasting, isolation, learning hundreds of songs and rituals, mastering extensive medicinal plant knowledge, and undergoing spiritual ordeals that test and strengthen shamanic power. Vision quests are crucial spiritual practices, especially for young men transitioning to adulthood, involving fasting and isolation in remote locations, while seeking spiritual visions that provide guidance, reveal spirit helpers, and grant powers or knowledge that will shape their adult life. The experience is psychologically and physically intense. Hunger, thirst, sleep deprivation, fear, and isolation in dangerous locations create altered states of consciousness, where spiritual encounters feel absolutely real regardless of what modern psychology might say about hallucination. But you can't just fake spiritual experiences that everyone else seems to have genuinely. Your inability to have authentic vision quest experiences, see spirits that others perceive, or receive spiritual communications that guide others, will mark you as spiritually deficient in ways that limit your social status and potentially exclude you from certain roles and activity. If you can't successfully complete a vision quest, you might never be fully recognized as adult man. If you can't perceive the spiritual realities that govern community life, you'll remain perpetual outsider regardless of your practical skill. The psychological pressure to have, or pretend to have spiritual experiences intense when everyone around you treats spiritual realm as obvious reality rather than superstition. You'll be tempted to fake visions to fit in, but shamans and elders might recognize false claims through their own spiritual discernment or through inconsistencies in your description. Being caught lying about spiritual experiences would be grave offense that damages your reputation permanently and marks you as spiritually fraudulent or contaminated. Communication with animals, not just observing their behavior but actually conversing with animal spirits who convey information, warnings or teachings, is normal part of spiritual life for many indigenous people. Hunters report asking animals for permission to hunt, receiving guidance from animal spirits about where game can be found, or experiencing spiritual encounters with animals who teach important lessons. Your inability to experience these communications suggests spiritual blindness or damaged relationship with natural world, and the spiritual ceremonies you're required to participate in will challenge your modern skepticism. Ceremonies you don't understand but must participate in. Religious ceremonies govern the seasonal cycles, mark major life transitions, celebrate successful hunts or harvests, mourn deaths, prepare for warfare, heal illnesses, and maintain community cohesion through shared spiritual experience. These ceremonies aren't optional. Participation is expected, unless you're specifically excluded due to spiritual contamination, and refusing to participate marks you as antisocial or spiritually dangerous. The ceremonies involve elements that will seem strange or uncomfortable to modern sensibilities,
prolonged fasting, sleep deprivation, painful physical ordeals, consumption of psychoactive substances, exposure to extreme temperatures in sweat lodges, bloodletting, and other practices that test physical endurance and create altered states of consciousness where spiritual experiences occur. The sun dance ceremony of some plains tribes, for example, involves dancers having wooden skewers inserted through chest or back skin, and dancing while attached to central pole until the skewers tear through flesh, an ordeal that demonstrates courage, creates trance states, and generates spiritual vision. Your participation in these ceremonies without understanding their meaning or experiencing their spiritual dimensions makes you go through motions without genuine engagement, which other participants might recognize and judge as disrespectful or indicative of spiritual problems requiring intervention. The ceremonies aren't performances, but rather real spiritual work that requires authentic engagement, and your inability to engage authentically isolates you from the deep communal bonding that ceremonies create. Some ceremonies are gender-specific, age-specific, or reserved for certain clan members or individuals with particular spiritual status. You need to know which ceremonies you're allowed or required to attend versus which ones you must avoid, because your presence would be spiritually contaminating or offensive. Accidentally attending forbidden ceremony could cause serious problems requiring purification rituals or even punishment depending on how serious the violation is viewed. But the most profound spiritual challenge is death and what comes after. Death in indigenous spirituality isn't end of existence, but rather transition to different state of being, where the deceased person continues to exist in spirit form, potentially interacting with the living through dreams, visions, or spiritual encounter. The boundary between living and dead isn't absolute. Deceased relatives remain part of the community in spiritual sense, and their needs must be attended to through proper burial practices, offering, and rituals that ensure they transition successfully to the afterlife, rather than becoming malevolent spirits who harm the living.
Raids, revenge, and counting coup. Warfare between indigenous tribes is common reality in 1491, driven by competition for resources, revenge for past wrongs, demonstration of masculine courage, capture of prisoners for adoption or slavery, and complex political dynamics between neighboring peoples who are sometimes allies and sometimes enemies, depending on shifting circumstances. The stereotypical peaceful Indians living in harmony with nature and each other is a romantic myth that ignores the real violence and conflict that characterize pre-Columbian Americas as much as any other time and place in human history. Raids are a frequent form of conflict involving small war parties attacking enemy villages to kill warriors, steal horses or other valuable property, capture women and children for adoption into the raiding tribe, and demonstrate courage without committing to full-scale warfare that could devastate both sides. These raids keep communities in constant state of vigilance, requiring guards, defensive preparations, and readiness to either flee or fight, depending on the size and intent of attacking force. If you're male, you'll be expected to participate in warfare when your tribe is in conflict, risking your life in combat against enemies who are trying to kill you while you try to kill them. There's no opting out based on pacifist principles or personal preference to avoid violence. Refusing to fight marks you as coward, who lacks masculine courage, and who cannot be trusted to protect the community. Your participation in warfare is fundamental obligation of masculine identity that you cannot escape regardless of your modern attitudes about violence. But indigenous warfare follows different rules than European-style battles you might imagine. Counting coup is a prestige system in some tribes where touching enemy with coup stick and escaping alive brings more honor than simply killing from distance. The close approach to enemy demonstrates courage and skill in ways that arrow shots don't, and warriors compete for coup honors that establish their reputations and social status. This system means that warfare isn't always about maximizing enemy casualties, but rather about demonstrating personal courage through dangerous encounters. The motivations for warfare include revenge killings to balance deaths. If your tribe member is killed by another tribe, your people might raid them to kill one of theirs in return, maintaining balance through reciprocal violence that can continue for generations in ongoing cycles of revenge. The logic of blood revenge makes sense within honor-based societies where group reputation and individual courage are more important than minimizing casualties or achieving diplomatic resolution. Torture of prisoners, particularly enemy warriors, is practiced in some tribes as a way to test captives' courage, demonstrate the capturing tribe's power, satisfy revenge desires, and reinforce social bonds through communal participation in violence.
violence against outsiders. The torture methods are gruesome and prolonged, designed to cause maximum suffering while the captive demonstrates courage by refusing to cry out or beg for mercy, earning respect even from captors while also serving as warning to other enemies about what awaits them if they're captured. And these violence practices will challenge your modern ethical sensibilities in profound ways. Torture, scalp, and harsh realities of war. Scalping, removing part of the scalp with hair still attached as trophy and proof of enemy death, is practiced in some regions and becomes more widespread after Europeans offer bounties for scalps, though the practice existed before European contact in some areas. The scalping victim might survive if only partial scalp is taken, and if infection doesn't kill them afterward, though they're permanently marked and often face social stigma or spiritual problems associated with being scalped and surviving. Women and children captured in raids might be adopted into the raiding tribe to replace members who've died, becoming full community members if they accept their new identity, or they might be enslaved, traded, or killed, depending on the tribe's practices and the captive's usefulness. The fate of captives varies dramatically. Some live out their lives as full tribal members, indistinguishable from birth members, while others remain in subordinate positions or don't survive captivity. Your modern ethical framework that condemns torture, collective punishment, slavery, and violence against non-combatants won't translate easily to warrior culture, where these practices serve important social functions, demonstrate courage, satisfy revenge obligations, and reinforce group boundaries. Your reluctance to participate in or even observe these practices will mark you as weak or culturally incompetent, but your participation will traumatize you in ways that indigenous warriors socialized to accept violence from childhood might not experience. But you also need to understand why tribes fight rather than just condemning the violence. Why tribes fight each other constantly. Resource competition is fundamental driver of conflict. Tribes compete for hunting territories, fishing sites, agricultural land, and access to valuable resources like obsidian, copper, or shells that are concentrated in certain locations. As populations grow or as climate shifts affect resource availability, the competition intensifies and tribes must either fight for access or accept reduced territories that might not support their population. Historical grievances and revenge cycles create ongoing conflicts that might continue for generations based on wrongs committed long ago by people who are now dead. The initial cause of conflict might be forgotten, but the tradition of hostility continues because each generation experiences raids and deaths that require revenge, perpetuating cycles that are difficult to break without either devastating one side completely or achieving diplomatic resolutions that require both sides to give up revenge claims. Some warfare is about prestige and demonstration of masculine courage rather than practical goals. Young men need opportunities to prove themselves in combat, earn warrior honors, and achieve the status that comes from brave deeds in warfare. In societies where masculine identity is closely tied to warrior prowess, there's social pressure to find enemies to fight even if there aren't serious resource conflicts or revenge obligations driving the violence. Political dynamics between tribes create complex alliance systems and rivalries. Tribes form confederacies for mutual defense, create trade partnerships that require maintaining peace, and sometimes fight proxy wars on behalf of more powerful groups. The political landscape is as complicated as any European state system, with shifting alliances, betrayals, peace treaties, and strategic calculations about when to fight and when to negotiate. And if you're injured in warfare or daily life, the medical care available will terrify you.
Bathing in rivers when it's freezing. Personal hygiene in 1491 follows practices that are surprisingly sophisticated in some respects, and shockingly inadequate in others, compared to modern standards. Many indigenous peoples bathe regularly in rivers, lakes, or specially constructed sweat lodges, maintaining cleanliness standards that actually exceed medieval European practices where bathing was viewed with suspicion and avoided for long periods. The stereotype of dirty Indians is European projection of their own hygiene failures onto peoples who are actually cleaner. But bathing in rivers means bathing in cold water year-round, or braving ice-covered water in winter, unless you have access to hot springs or sweat lodges that provide warm bathing options. The shock of cold water immersion in winter is physically painful and potentially dangerous, requiring tolerance for discomfort that modern people with heated showers can't imagine. You'll delay bathing as long as socially acceptable, building up body odors that indigenous peoples who bathe regularly despite the cold will find offensive. Sweat lodges provide heated bathing through steam created by pouring water over hot rocks in enclosed spaces, creating intense heat and humidity that opens pores, promotes sweating, and serves both hygiene and spiritual purification functions. The experience is physically intense. The heat can be overwhelming for people not accustomed to it, And the spiritual dimensions of sweat lodge ceremonies mean you're not just bathing but participating in sacred ritual with protocols you don't understand. But hygiene extends beyond bathing to other practices you'll find uncomfortable or inadequate. Dental hygiene without toothbrushes, toothpaste or floss means that dental problems are common. Cavities, gum disease, tooth loss and dental abscesses that can be fatal if infection spreads. Some tribes use frayed sticks or plant fibers to clean teeth, and dietary practices that include less sugar than modern diets reduce cavity formation somewhat. But dental health is generally poor by modern standards, and dental pain is a common condition that people endure without pain medication beyond herbal remedies of limited effectiveness. Menstruation for women involves practices that vary by culture but which generally lack modern sanitary products. Using absorbent plant materials, moss or animal hides to manage menstrual blood, along with cultural practices that often segregate menstruating women in separate dwellings because their powerful spiritual state during menstruation might interfere with hunting, magic, weapons or sacred objects. The segregation isn't necessarily oppressive. It can provide rest period where women are excused from normal labor and supported by other women. But it also limits mobility and participation during menstruation. Hair care, parasite control and management of body odors without modern products means accepting levels of discomfort and grooming challenges that modern hygiene products eliminate. Head lice, body lice, intestinal parasites and skin infections are common conditions that everyone deals with to varying degrees. Using herbal treatments, physical removal, and acceptance of minor parasites as normal part of life rather than medical emergencies requiring immediate intervention. And when you get sick or injured, the medical care available is primitive by modern standards. Herbal medicine that actually works, sometimes. Indigenous medical knowledge is extensive and sophisticated, developed through thousands of years of experimentation with medicinal plants, accumulated understanding of which plants help which conditions, and refined dosing and preparation methods that maximize effectiveness. Many modern pharmaceuticals are derived from plants that indigenous peoples used medicinally long before European contact. Aspirin from willow bark, quinine from cinchona bark, and hundreds of others that demonstrate the empirical validity of traditional medicine. But herbal medicine has significant limitations compared to modern pharmaceuticals. The active ingredient concentrations vary based on growing conditions and preparation methods. Side effects can be severe and unpredictable, and many conditions that respond well to modern antibiotics or surgical intervention cannot be effectively treated with plant remedies alone. The medicine works for some conditions and doesn't work for others, and you won't know which until you try it and either recover or die. Setting broken bones, treating wounds, managing infections, and dealing with acute injuries involves techniques that range from remarkably effective to completely inadequate depending on the injury severity. Simple fractures can be set and splinted effectively, allowing healing with minimal long-term consequences. Compound fractures with bone protruding through skin are likely to become infected and might require amputation or might kill you through sepsis that can't be prevented without antibiotics. But the most terrifying reality is that there are no doctors, no hospitals, no emergency service, no doctors, no hospitals, just hope and prayer. When you're seriously ill or injured, you depend entirely on local healers whose knowledge is substantial but limited, and on your own body's ability to heal itself without the medical interventions that save lives in modern hospitals. There's no calling an ambulance, no emergency room with trauma surgeons and intensive care, no antibiotics or pain medications beyond herbal remedies that provide limited relief, and no way to treat many conditions that modern medicine handles routinely. Infections that would be minor inconveniences in modern world with antibiotic treatment become life-threatening conditions in 1491, where infections can spread unchecked, causing sepsis, gangrene or death from what started as simple cut or scrape. You'll watch people die from infected wounds that could have been saved with basic antibiotics, and you'll live in constant fear that any injury could become infected and kill you despite your knowledge of germ theory that you can't translate into effective prevention without antiseptics or antibiotics. Childbirth kills mothers regularly from complications that cesarean sections would prevent, hemorrhage that blood transfusions would treat, or infections that antibiotics would cure. You'll watch women die in childbirth knowing that they could have been saved with modern obstetric care, but there's nothing you can do without the medical technology and surgical skills required to intervene effectively. Your knowledge that modern medicine could save them makes their deaths more painful rather than less. Infectious diseases that modern vaccines prevent spread through communities, killing children and adults.
measles, smallpox, which hasn't arrived from Europe yet but will soon devastate indigenous populations, influenza, and other diseases that are serious threats without modern medical intervention. The epidemics that will arrive with European contact haven't happened yet in 1491, but other diseases still kill regularly, and you're vulnerable to infections that you might never have been exposed to in modern world with vaccination and sanitation. And beyond just physical survival, you need to understand and appreciate the cultural richness that will soon be destroyed.
Beadwork, pottery, and why everything is symbolic. Indigenous arts are not mere decoration or hobby crafts, but rather sophisticated visual languages that communicate identity, status, spiritual beliefs, clan affiliations, and cultural knowledge through patterns, colors, materials, and designs that take years to master. The beadwork, quillwork, pottery, weaving, carving, and painting that you see are functional objects that also serve as text readable by those who understand the symbolic systems encoded in artistic traditions. Beadwork patterns identify which tribe or clan the wearer belongs to, indicate their achievements and status, and sometimes tell stories or communicate spiritual meanings through geometric patterns that seem merely decorative to untrained eyes, but which carry specific meanings within the culture. Learning to create proper beadwork requires not just manual dexterity, but also knowledge of which patterns are appropriate for your status, which belong to specific families or clans, and which carry spiritual significance requiring permission to use. Pottery styles vary dramatically between regions based on available clay, firing techniques, and aesthetic traditions that have developed over centuries. The shape, decoration, and function of pottery carry information about the maker's cultural identity and artistic skill. Southwest Pueblo pottery, with its distinctive black-on-white designs, Mississippian pottery with elaborate shell-tempered construction, and other regional styles represent high artistic achievement and technological sophistication that equals any old-world pottery tradition. But you can't create these arts without years of training and cultural knowledge. Your attempts at beadwork will produce awkward, aesthetically unpleasing objects that don't follow proper patterns and might inadvertently use designs that you're not entitled to, or that carry meanings you don't intend. Your pottery will crack during firing or be poorly formed compared to expert potters who've practiced for decades. Your artistic incompetence is another area where you're revealed as essentially useless at skills that community members master through patient apprenticeship. The symbolic systems embedded in arts are inaccessible to you without cultural education. You can't read the patterns, don't understand the color symbolism, and can't interpret the artistic communications that pass between knowledgeable community members. You're artistically illiterate in culture where art is language rather than mere decoration, and your illiteracy excludes you from understanding important cultural communication. Ownership and transmission of designs is sometimes restricted. Certain patterns belong to specific clans or families and can't be used by others. Some designs require spiritual authority to create, and copying others' designs without permission might be theft of intellectual spiritual property that carries social consequences. Your modern notion of art as individual creative expression doesn't match indigenous systems where artistic traditions are collective property with rules governing their proper use. But art exists within broader context of storytelling and cultural transmission. Storytelling as entertainment and education. Oral traditions carry history, cultural knowledge, ethical teachings, practical information, and entertainment without writing systems that European cultures depend on for cultural transmission. The stories told around fires during long winter nights serve multiple functions simultaneously, entertaining listeners, teaching children proper behavior, preserving historical memories, explaining natural phenomena, transmitting practical knowledge, and bonding community through shared narratives. The storytellers are respected community members with excellent memories, dramatic skill, and deep knowledge of traditional stories that they've learned from previous generations and which they'll pass on to future generations with variations that reflect their own interpretations and experiences. The oral tradition isn't static memorization but rather living tradition that evolves while maintaining core narratives that define cultural identity. Your inability to participate in storytelling, both because you don't know the traditional stories and because your language skills are inadequate for complex narrative performance, excludes you from important cultural practice that bonds community and transmits value. You can listen but not contribute, observe but not participate, receive but not give in cultural exchange that defines community membership.
And storytelling connects to music and dance that are inseparable from ceremonial and social life. Music, dance, and ceremonies that last for days. Music and dance are integral to ceremonies, celebrations, courtship, warfare preparation, healing rituals, and essentially every important social activity. The songs carry spiritual power, historical knowledge, and emotional expression that creates shared experiences bonding participants together. The dances are athletic performances requiring skill and endurance, not mere entertainment but rather serious cultural work that accomplishes social and spiritual purpose. Ceremonies can last for days or even weeks, requiring sustained participation, physical endurance, and mental focus that modern people with short attention spans find difficult to maintain. You'll struggle with the length and intensity of ceremonies that require fasting, sleep deprivation, continuous dancing, and sustained concentration on ritual activities that seem repetitive but which serve important functions within spiritual framework. The instruments, drums, rattles, flutes, bells, are not mere musical tools but sometimes sacred objects with spiritual significance requiring proper treatment and respect. You can't just pick up a drum and play it for fun. You need to understand which drums are for general use versus which are sacred, what rhythms are appropriate for different contexts, and how to participate in musical traditions without giving offense. And all of this cultural richness exists within seasonal cycles that determine survival.
Winter is coming, and it could kill you. Seasonal cycles govern every aspect of life in 1491, determining where you live, what you eat, what work you do, and whether you survive until spring. Winter is an existential threat that kills people regularly through cold exposure, starvation, and inability to maintain adequate shelter and warmth. Without modern heating systems or stored food supplies that don't spoil, preparing for winter occupies much of summer and fall, preserving meat through smoking and drying, gathering and storing plant foods, accumulating firewood, repairing or constructing winter shelter, making warm clothing, and completing all tasks that become impossible or dangerous once snow and cold arrive. Your incompetence at these preparations makes you dependent on others' labor and planning, and if stored food runs low in late winter, you might face starvation alongside everyone else who suffers from insufficient preparation. The cold itself is dangerous in ways modern people with central heating can't appreciate. Temperatures drop far below freezing for months, and maintaining warmth requires constant fire tending, adequate shelter, and proper clothing that you might not know how to make or maintain. Frostbite, hypothermia, and death from exposure are real threats that kill people who make mistakes in winter survival, and your modern body raised in climate-controlled environments is unprepared for sustained cold that never relents for months. But winter isn't just physical survival challenge, it's psychological ordeal. The darkness, cold, confinement to shelter, limited food, and inability to travel or engage in normal activities create psychological stress that modern people with seasonal affective disorder can relate to, but which is much more severe in pre-modern winter, when there's no escape from seasonal hardship. You're trapped in shelter with same people for months, unable to leave for privacy, eating monotonous stored foods, and hoping that supplies last until spring growth begins. The late winter starving time is real crisis. When stored foods run low, hunting becomes difficult due to deep snow and depleted animal populations, and new plant growth hasn't started yet. People lose weight, become weak, and sometimes die from malnutrition or starvation during the difficult weeks between winter food exhaustion and spring abundance. Your body will learn hunger in ways that modern people with constant food availability never experience. And seasonal patterns affect more than just winter survival. Following the buffalo or staying put, migration patterns vary dramatically between tribes. Some are nomadic, following buffalo herds or seasonal food sources across vast territories, while others are sedentary, living in permanent villages and relying on agriculture supplemented by hunting and gathering. The lifestyle differences are profound, affecting everything from shelter construction to social organization to cultural practices. Nomadic life requires portable possessions, temporary shelter, constant movement, extensive geographic knowledge, and physical endurance to cover long distances while carrying supplies. You can't accumulate many possessions because you have to carry everything, can't build permanent structures because you'll abandon them soon, and can't form attachments to specific places because mobility is survival strategy. The freedom of nomadic life comes with constant labor of moving and uncertainty about food availability. Sedentary agricultural life offers stability, permanent shelter, accumulated possessions, and stronger defensive positions, but requires different skills, farming knowledge, food storage, construction techniques, and political organization to coordinate communal agricultural labor and defend fixed settlements from raids. You're tied to specific location by agricultural investment and stored foods, making you more vulnerable to enemies who know where to find you. And regardless of lifestyle, seasonal foods determine what and when you eat. Seasonal foods, and how to not starve in winter. Spring brings relief from winter scarcity with new plant growth, migratory birds returning with eggs, fish spawning runs that provide concentrated protein, and general renewal of food availability that allows recovery from winter deprivation. The spring foods, fresh greens, berries beginning to ripen, young animals, are eagerly anticipated after months of dried or smoked foods. Summer is abundant season when food is plentiful, game animals are fat, plants are producing, fishing is productive, and the main challenge is processing and storing enough food for winter rather than finding adequate food to eat today. The summer work is intense, gathering, hunting, preserving and preparing for the scarcity that will return with winter. Fall is crucial preparation time when final food gathering occurs before winter. Hunting intensifies to build meat reserves, and all winter preparations must be completed before weather turns too harsh for outdoor work. The fall work determines winter survival. Communities that prepare well eat adequately through winter, while those that fail to prepare adequately face starvation before spring. And all of this happens within social structures that determine your status and opportunity. Chiefs, elders and councils, democracy-ish. Political organization varies dramatically between indigenous nations. Some have hereditary chiefs from specific families, others elect leaders based on merit and achievement, and many use council systems where decisions are made collectively rather than by single rulers. The political sophistication ranges from simple band-level organization to complex confederacies like the Iroquois League, with formal governmental structures, diplomatic protocols, and democratic decision-making processes. Chiefs or leaders aren't absolute rulers, but rather influential individuals, whose authority depends on their ability to build consensus, demonstrate wisdom, and serve community interest. A chief who makes poor decisions or acts contrary to community welfare can be removed from leadership through various mechanisms, depending on the tribe's political system. Leadership is as much burden as privilege. Leaders are expected to be generous, work harder than others, mediate disputes, and sometimes sacrifice personal interests for community benefit. Elder councils of respected older individuals provide wisdom based on experience, making important decisions about warfare, diplomacy, resource management, and spiritual matters. The elders' authority comes from accumulated knowledge, successful navigation of life's challenges, and respect earned through decades of service to community. Your youth and incompetence mean you have no political voice, and won't be taken seriously in community decision-making regardless of your modern democratic values. But social status isn't fixed. It can be earned through achievement, earning respect through deeds, not birth. Social mobility exists in many indigenous societies where individuals can earn status through hunting prowess, warfare courage, generosity, spiritual gifts, or other achievements that benefit community. A young person from ordinary family can become respected warrior, successful hunter, or spiritual leader through demonstrated competence and character, though some societies with hereditary aristocracies limit mobility more than others. Your modern education, professional credentials, and economic status mean nothing here. Social respect must be earned through skills that matter in pre-modern survival context, and you lack those skills. You start at bottom of social hierarchy regardless of whatever status you held in modern world, and climbing to respectability requires demonstrating competence at activities you're fundamentally unprepared for. Generosity is crucial for building and maintaining status. Successful hunters are expected to share meat widely, wealthy individuals are expected to give away possessions in ceremonial giveaways, and hoarding resources for personal benefit rather than sharing with community members in need is antisocial behavior that damages reputation. Your modern capitalist instinct to accumulate and protect personal wealth conflicts with indigenous values emphasizing generosity and reciprocal obligation. But there are also people who fall outside normal social structure, outcasts, criminals, and tribal justice. Criminal justice in 1491 operates through community consensus and restitution rather than through prisons, police, or formal legal systems that don't exist yet. Crimes like theft,
assault or violation of sexual norms are handled through mechanisms that restore balance, compensate victims and reintegrate offenders if possible or exile them if necessary. The justice isn't about punishment for punishment's sake but rather about restoring social harmony and preventing future violation. Serious crimes like murder might require blood revenge by victim's family unless compensation can be negotiated that satisfies the grievance. The payment of valuable goods, marriage to replace the lost person, or other restitution that balances the wrong. Refusing to accept compensation might mean ongoing revenge cycle where victim's family pursues killer and killer's family protects them, creating feud that can last generations. Outcasts and exiles who violated community norms too seriously to remain members face harsh reality of trying to survive alone or finding another tribe willing to adopt them. Exile is essentially death sentence in many environments where individual survival without community support is nearly impossible. You need cooperation for hunting, protection from enemies, and access to resources that individuals cannot manage alone. And looming over all of this is historical catastrophe that you alone know is coming. 4091 is the last year of normal. You're living in the last year before European contact transforms indigenous Americas forever, through disease, warfare, colonization, and cultural destruction that will devastate populations and destroy much of what you're experiencing. The year 1491 is final moment of pre-Columbian normalcy before catastrophe begins, and you're witnessing world that's about to end in ways that indigenous peoples can't imagine or prepare for. The population estimates for pre-Columbian Americas range from 50 to 100 million people living in complex societies from the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego, representing cultural diversity and population density that Europeans will never fully comprehend because they'll arrive after disease pandemics have already killed 90% of indigenous population. The empty wilderness that colonizers claim to find is actually post-apocalyptic landscape where most inhabitants have recently died from diseases brought by Europeans. The sophisticated agricultural systems, urban centers, trade network and political organizations that exist in 1491 will be destroyed so thoroughly that later historians will underestimate pre-Columbian civilization, assuming that indigenous peoples were always sparse and primitive, rather than understanding that they were reduced to that state by catastrophic population collapse. You're witnessing height of indigenous civilization before the fall, but you can't stop what's coming. Rumors of strange pale people from the east. Some indigenous peoples near the coasts or in Caribbean might already be hearing rumors of strange pale people arriving in large boats from the east. Christopher Columbus has already made his first voyage and the news of European arrival might be spreading through trade networks, even if most interior tribes haven't encountered Europeans directly yet. The rumors might describe pale-skinned people with metal tools, strange clothing and weapons that shoot fire, descriptions that seem fantastical but which are absolutely true. Your knowledge of what's coming, the diseases that will kill most indigenous peoples, the warfare and enslavement, the land theft and cultural destruction, the centuries of oppression and genocide that will follow European contact is useless for preventing any of it. You can't convince people to prepare for threats they can't imagine, can't stop epidemics without vaccines or antibiotics, and can't prevent colonization that will be driven by European technology, disease advantages, and political organization that indigenous peoples won't be able to resist effectively. The moral dilemma of living with this knowledge is profound. Do you try to warn people about coming catastrophe even though they won't believe you and can't prevent it anyway? Do you try to document the cultures and knowledge that will be lost, even though you lack the ability to preserve it effectively? Do you simply try to survive and accept that you can't change history despite knowing how terribly it will unfold? And your knowledge of this future makes the present both more precious and more painful. Your knowledge of what's coming but can't stop it. Every ceremony you witness, every story you hear, every cultural practice you observe, is about to be destroyed or transformed beyond recognition. The languages being spoken will become extinct or endangered. The religious practices will be suppressed by Christian missionaries. The political systems will be destroyed by colonial governments, and the populations will be devastated by diseases that indigenous immune systems have never encountered. The children playing around you will likely die from smallpox, measles, or other European diseases before they reach adulthood. The elders teaching you their language and customs will be some of the last people to remember the old ways before everything changes. The warriors proudly showing off their courage and skill will be overwhelmed by European firearms and military technology that they can't match with Stone Age weapons. Your modern perspective makes you appreciate the sophistication, beauty, and humanity of indigenous cultures in ways that contemporary Europeans who view indigenous peoples as primitive savages never will. You can see the complexity of their political system, the effectiveness of their ecological management, the richness of their artistic traditions, and the humanity of their social relationships in ways that colonizers will refuse to recognize, because acknowledging indigenous sophistication would undermine justifications for conquest and colonization. The tragedy of knowing what's coming is that you can't prevent it, can't save the people you've come to know and care about, and can't preserve more than fragments of the cultural richness that will be lost. Your knowledge makes you witness to impending catastrophe rather than participant who can change outcomes, and the helplessness is psychologically crushing as you watch doomed world continuing its normal activities without knowing that everything is about to end. And this knowledge forces you to confront whether you could actually survive here if you had to. Skills you'd need to actually survive. Let's be brutally honest about your survival prospects in 1491. You would probably die within months, if not weeks, without the extensive support and tolerance of indigenous community members who have no obligation to keep you alive. Your modern skill set is almost completely useless for pre-modern survival, and learning the necessary skills would take years of training that you might not survive long enough to complete. The essential survival skills you lack include hunting with Stone Age weapons, tracking animals across varied terrain, processing game animals from killing to usable meat and materials, identifying and gathering edible plants while avoiding poisonous ones, making fire without matches or lighters, constructing shelter from natural materials, making clothing and tools from scratch, navigating without maps or GPS, predicting weather from natural signs, treating injuries and illnesses with herbal medicine, speaking at least one indigenous language fluently, and understanding the cultural protocols that govern social interactions and spiritual practices. Each of these skills takes years to develop through apprenticeship and practice. You can't just learn them from books or videos, you need hands-on training with expert practitioners who correct your mistakes and guide your development. The learning curve is steep and unforgiving, with mistakes potentially causing injury, illness, social ostracism, or death depending on which skills you fail to master, and what consequences follow from your incompetence. But beyond technical skills, you need psychological adaptations that might be even harder to achieve. The mental toughness required for pre-modern survival includes accepting constant discomfort from cold, heat, hunger, and exhaustion without modern palliatives, enduring boredom during long winters with no entertainment beyond conversation and traditional games, tolerating lack of privacy in communal living situations, managing fear of violence, wild animals, and supernatural threats that feel very real in cultures with different worldviews, and accepting death of children, friends, and family members as normal tragedy rather than exceptional crisis requiring grief counseling and professional intervention. Your modern psychology is adapted for a comfortable, predictable environment with abundant food, climate control, entertainment, privacy, and medical care. The psychological shock of losing all these supports simultaneously, while also facing language barriers, cultural incompetence, and social marginalization could cause mental breakdown, even if you somehow survive the physical challenges. Depression, anxiety, trauma, and despair are likely psychological outcomes that indigenous peoples might interpret as spiritual illness requiring shamanic intervention rather than psychological counseling that doesn't exist yet. The social skills required for survival include relationships and trust with people who have every reason to be suspicious of your incompetence and strange behaviors, demonstrating enough value to justify the resources community invests in keeping you alive, learning and following cultural protocols without causing offense, navigating companionship and political systems, and eventually finding spouse and establishing family that integrates you fully into community, rather than remaining perpetual outsider dependent on others' tolerance. And the harsh reality is that modern humans would probably fail at survival. Why modern humans would probably die quickly. Your physical fitness, even if you're athletic by modern standards, is inappropriate for pre-modern survival. Gym workouts develop wrong muscles for activities like tracking game for hours, processing buffalo carcasses, or carrying loads over long distances. You lack calluses on hands and feet from lifetime of using tools and walking barefoot or in minimal footwear. Your metabolism is adapted to 3 meals per day rather than intermittent eating patterns with periods of scarcity. Your immune system hasn't been exposed to parasites and pathogens that are common in pre-modern environments. The psychological adjustment challenges mentioned earlier, accepting discomfort, boredom, lack of privacy, constant death, and food insecurity, would break most modern people who've never experienced sustained hardship without ability to opt out or seek help from systems that no longer exist. Suicide rates might be high among time travelers who can't psychologically adapt to pre-modern realities. Assuming the community allows you to end your own life rather than viewing it as spiritual crime requiring intervention. Your inability to contribute economically to community survival makes you net drain on resources rather than productive member. You consume food, occupy space, require supervision and teach, and provide nothing in return during the extended learning period, before you become minimally competent. Communities might decide that supporting you isn't worth the costs, especially if they're facing resource scarcity that makes extra mouths to feed dangerous to group survive. But if you somehow survived and even thrived, you'd need to respect what you've learned. Respecting indigenous cultures in retrospect. The experience of living in 1491, if you survived it, would fundamentally change your understanding of indigenous peoples and their culture. You'd recognize that primitive is completely inaccurate description of societies with sophisticated knowledge systems, complex political organizations, rich artistic traditions, and effective survival strategies developed over thousands of years. You'd understand that indigenous peoples weren't simple children of nature, but rather successful civilizations adapted to their environments through accumulated wisdom that Europeans consistently undervalue. You'd appreciate that the noble savage stereotype is as offensive and inaccurate as the primitive savage stereotype. Indigenous peoples were neither impossibly virtuous peace lovers, living in perfect harmony, nor brutal primitives needing civilization. They were complex human societies with virtues and flaws, capable of great beauty and great cruelty, organized in ways that worked for their contexts even if they seem strange to modern observers. You'd recognize that the catastrophe of European colonization wasn't inevitable progress of superior civilization replacing inferior one, but rather tragic collision of different societies where European diseases, technology, and political organization allowed conquest that destroyed sophisticated cultures and killed millions of people. The historical narrative of European discovery and settlement looks very different when you understand what was actually lost and how it was destroyed. And most importantly, you'd understand that indigenous peoples who survived colonization deserve recognition, respect, and justice. Modern indigenous peoples aren't remnants of vanished primitive past, but rather survivors and descendants of sophisticated civilizations that were devastated by colonization but which persist through cultural resilience, adapt, and determination to maintain identities despite centuries of attempted genocide and cultural destruction. The languages, spiritual practices, artistic traditions, and political movements of contemporary indigenous peoples connect directly to the pre-Columbian cultures you've experienced, and understanding that continuity should inform how modern societies relate to indigenous rights, land claims, cultural preservation, and historical justice. Your time in 1491 would teach you that indigenous knowledge systems have value that modern society often ignores. Ecological management practices, agricultural techniques, medicinal plant knowledge, sustainable resource use, and social organization methods that might offer solutions to modern problems, if we're willing to learn from cultures that survived for thousands of years, in ways that modern civilization hasn't yet proven it can match. Respecting indigenous peoples means recognizing that they have knowledge and perspectives that deserve attention rather than dismissal as primitive superstition or romantic nostalgia.
And just like that, your alarm clock jolts you back to the modern world. You're not in a tipi surrounded by smoke and animal hides. You're in your comfortable bed with clean sheets and a soft mattress. You're not wearing leather clothing made from animals you helped kill. You're in pajamas made in a factory from synthetic materials. You're not worried about whether you'll find food today or whether winter will kill you. You're planning what to order for breakfast delivery while checking your phone for messages. The relief is overwhelming. You don't have to hunt buffalo, learn an impossible language, navigate complex cultural protocols, or survive without modern medicine and technology. You have grocery stores, central heating, indoor plumbing, antibiotics, and all the other conveniences that make modern life comfortable and safe compared to the brutal realities of. You're not actually dependent on Stone Age skills for survival, and you're not actually facing the catastrophic destruction of your entire world by colonization. But the dream has changed you in ways that won't fade with morning. You can't look at Native American history the same way anymore.
The stereotypes about primitive Indians living in harmony with nature have been replaced with understanding of complex, sophisticated societies that were destroyed by European colonization. The Thanksgiving mythology about grateful natives welcoming pilgrims seems horrifically naive when you understand the catastrophic population collapse and cultural destruction that European contact caused. The Western expansion narrative about settling empty wilderness is exposed as colonizer propaganda that erased the millions of indigenous people who died from diseases and violence before settlers arrived. You appreciate your modern life differently now. The abundance of food, the comfort of climate control, the safety of modern medicine, and the convenience of technology that you took for granted before experiencing their absence. You understand that human survival without modern supports requires skills, knowledge, and psychological resilience that you don't possess and that most modern people have never developed. You're aware of your own incompetence at basic survival in ways that make you humble about humanity's technological dependence. And you have questions that won't let you rest. Could you actually survive in four? Probably not for long unless you got very lucky with finding a community willing to support and teach you despite your uselessness. Would the experience have been worth the hardship? Maybe, if you survived long enough to learn the language and culture. You'd have insights into indigenous civilizations that no historical research can fully provide. Would you volunteer to go back? Absolutely not. The physical hardship, constant danger, cultural isolation and knowledge of impending catastrophe would be psychologically devastating even if you somehow survived physically. But the biggest question is what you do with the understanding you've gained from this imaginary experience. Do you educate yourself and others about actual indigenous history rather than accepting simplified narrative? Do you support contemporary indigenous peoples in their struggles for rights, recognition and justice? Do you appreciate and learn from indigenous knowledge systems that might offer solutions to modern environmental and social problems? Do you recognize your own privilege and vulnerability by understanding what life is like without modern supports that you depend on constantly? The choice is yours. You can forget this dream and return to comfortable ignorance, or you can let it change how you understand history, appreciate the present, and think about the future. So hey, are you still awake? Or did the dream of 1491 put you to sleep peacefully, maybe with nightmares about hunting buffalo or trying to learn impossible languages? If you made it through this entire journey without dozing off, drop a comment and tell me, what aspect of pre-Columbian indigenous life surprised you the most? What modern convenience would you miss most if you had to survive in four? And do you think you could actually make it more than a month without modern technology, language skills, or survival knowledge? Hit that like button if this story made you rethink everything you thought you knew about Native American history. Subscribe for more time-traveling adventures that destroy comfortable myths about the past. And share this with someone who needs to understand that indigenous peoples weren't primitive savages, but rather sophisticated civilizations that were destroyed by colonization they couldn't have predicted or prevented. Sweet dreams, time travelers, and maybe appreciate your heated bedroom, stocked refrigerator, and modern medicine a little more when you wake up tomorrow morning. Because 1491 was real for millions of people, and most of them didn't survive what came next. Until next time, stay curious about actual history instead of sanitized mythology. Recognize that modern comfort comes with dependencies that make you vulnerable in ways our ancestors never were. And remember that the best way to honor indigenous peoples who survived catastrophic colonization is to learn their real histories, respect their contemporary struggles, and acknowledge that they're not vanished relics but living peoples with continuity from pre-Columbian past to present day. And one final thought before you drift off. If this story taught you anything, it should be that human societies are far more complex and capable than simple labels like primitive or advanced suggest. The indigenous peoples of 1491 had sophisticated knowledge, effective social systems, and rich cultural traditions that allowed them to thrive for thousands of years. The fact that European colonization destroyed much of what they built doesn't mean they were inferior. It means they faced catastrophic diseases and military technology that no amount of cultural sophistication could overcome. Respect the past, honor the survivors, and learn from histories that challenge comfortable narratives about progress and civilization. Now seriously, are you still reading, or did you finally fall asleep during that philosophical conclusion? If you're still here, you're either an insomniac who needs better bedtime stories or someone genuinely interested in indigenous history, and either way, I appreciate you making it to the end of this extremely long journey through pre-Columbian America. Drop that comment, hit that subscribe button, and get some sleep, because tomorrow you'll wake up in the modern world with all its problems and privileges, and maybe you'll appreciate it a little differently after imagining what life was like in 1491 when survival was uncertain, comfort was rare, and catastrophe was coming that nobody could prevent.